Joe Bain was a pawnbroker, a fat, lazy, bald man whose features seemed pulled to the left by his lifetime of looking at the world through a jeweler's glass. He was a lonely, untalented man, and would not have wanted to go on living had he been prevented from playing every day save Sunday, the one game he played brilliantly: the acquiring of objects for very little, and the selling of them for a great deal more. He was obsessed by the game, the one opportunity life offered him to best his fellow man. The game was the thing. The money he made a secondary matter, a way of keeping score. When Joe Bain opened his shop on Monday morning, a black ceiling of rain clouds had settled below the valley's rim, holding the city in a dark pocket of dead, dank air. Autumn thunder grumbled along the misty hillsides. No sooner had Bain hung up his coat and hat and umbrella, taken off his rubbers, turned on the lights, and settled his great bulk on a stool behind a counter than a lean young man in overalls, shy and dark as an Indian, plainly poor and awed by the city, walked in to offer him a fantastic pocket watch for $500. "No, sir," said the young farmer politely. "I don't want to borrow money on it. I want to sell it if I can get enough for it." He seemed reluctant to hand it to Bain, and cupped it tenderly in his rough hands for a moment before setting it down on a square of black velvet. "I kind of hope to hang on to it and pass it on to my oldest boy, but we need the money a whole lot worse right now." $500 is a lot of money," said Bain, like a man who had been victimized too often by his own kindness. He examined the jewels studding the watch without betraying anything of his inner amazement. He turned the watch this way and that, catching the glare of the ceiling light in 4 diamonds marking the hours, 3, 6, 9, and 12, and the ruby crowning the winder. The jewels alone, Bain reflected, were worth at least 4 times what the farmer was asking. "I don't get much call for a watch like this," said Bain. "If I tied up $500 in it, I might be stuck with it for years before the right man came along." He watched the farmer's sunburned face and thought he read there that the watch could be had for a good bit less. "There ain't another one like it in the whole country," said the farmer in a clumsy attempt at salesmanship. "That's my point," said Bain. "Who wants a watch like this?" Bain, for one, wanted it, and was already regarding it as his own. He pressed a button on the side of the case, striking the nearest hour on sweet, clear chimes. "You want it or not?" said the farmer. Now, said Bain, "this isn't the kind of deal you just dive head first into. I'd have to know more about this watch before I bought it." He pried open the back and found inside an engraved inscription in a foreign language. "What does this say? Any idea?" "Showed it to a schoolteacher back home," said the young man, "and all she could say was it looked a whole lot like German." Bain laid a sheet of tissue paper over the inscription and rubbed a pencil back and forth across it until he'd picked up a legible copy. He gave the copy and a dime to a shoeshine boy loitering by the door and sent him down the block to ask a German restaurant proprietor for a translation. The first drops of rain were spattering clean streaks on the sooty glass when Bain said casually to the farmer, "The cops keep pretty close check on what comes in here." The farmer reddened. "The watch is mine, all right. I got it in the war," he said. "Uh-huh. And you paid duty on it." "Duty?" "Certainly. You can't bring jewelry into this country without paying taxes on it. That's smuggling." "Just tucked it in my barracks bag and brought her on home the way everybody done," said the farmer. He was as worried as Bain had hoped. "Contraband," said Bain. "Just about the same as stolen goods." He held up his hands placatingly. "I don't mean I can't buy it. I just want to point out to you that it'd be a tricky thing to handle." If you were willing to let it go for, say, $100 maybe, I'd take a chance on it to help you out. I try to give veterans a break here whenever I can. $100? That's all? That's all it's worth. And I'm probably a sucker to offer that, said Bain. What the hell? That's an easy $100 for you, isn't it? What'd you do, cop it off some German prisoner or find it lying around in the ruins? No, sir, said the farmer. It was a little tougher than that. Bain, who was keenly sensitive to such things, saw that the farmer, as he began to tell how he'd gotten the watch, was regaining the stubborn confidence that had deserted him when he'd left his farm for the city to make the sale. My best buddy Buzzer and me, said the farmer, were prisoners of war together in some hills in Germany. In Sudetenland, somebody said it was. One morning, Buzzer woke me up and said the war was over. The guards were gone. The gates were open. Joe Bain was impatient at first with having to listen to the tale, but it was a tale told well and proudly, and long a fan of others' adventures for want of any of his own, Bain began to see, enviously, the two soldiers walking through the open gates of their prison and down a country road in the hills early on a bright spring morning in 1945, on the day the Second World War ended in Europe. The young farmer, whose name was Eddie, and his best buddy Buzzer, walked out into peace and freedom, skinny, ragged, dirty, and hungry, but with no ill will toward anyone. They'd gone to war out of pride, not bitterness. Now the war was over, the job done, and they wanted only to go home. They were a year apart, but as like as two poplars and a windbreak. Their notion was to take a brief sightseeing tour of the neighborhood near the camp, then to come back and wait with the rest of the prisoners for the arrival of some official liberators. But the plan evaporated when a pair of Canadian prisoners invited the buddies to toast victory with a bottle of brandy they'd found in a wrecked German truck. Their shrunken bellies gloriously hot and tingling, their heads light and full of trust and love for all mankind, Eddie and Buzzer found themselves swept along by a jostling, plaintive parade of German refugees that jammed the main road through the hills, refugees fleeing from the Russian tanks that growled monotonously and unopposed in the valley behind and below them. The tanks were coming to occupy this last undefended bit of German soil. "What are we running from?" said Buzzer. "The war's over, ain't it?" "Everybody else is running," said Eddie, "so I guess maybe we better be running too." "I don't even know where we are," said Buzzer. "Them Canadians said it's Sudetenland." "Where's that?" "Where we're at," said Eddie. "Swell guys, them Canadians. I'll tell the world." "Man," said Buzzer, "I love everybody today. Woo-wee! I'd like to get me a bottle of that brandy and put a nipple on it and go to bed with it for a week." Eddie touched the elbow of a tall, worried-looking man with close-cropped black hair who wore a civilian suit too small for him. "Where are we running to, sir? Ain't the war over?" The man glared, grunted something, and pushed by roughly. "He don't understand English," said Eddie. "Well, hell, man," said Buzzer. "Why don't you talk to these folks in their native tongue? Don't hide your candle under a bushel. Let's hear you sprechen some Deutsch to this man here." They'd come alongside a small, low black roadster, which was stalled on the shoulder of the road. A heavily muscled, square-faced young man was tinkering with the dead motor. On the leather front seat of the car sat an older man whose face was covered with dust and several days' growth of black beard, and shaded by a hat with the brim pulled down. Eddie and Buzzer stopped. "All right," said Eddie. "Just listen to this. Wie geht's?" he said to the blond man, using the only German he knew. "Good, good," muttered the young German. Then, realizing the absurdity of his automatic reply to the greeting, he replied with terrible bitterness, "Ja, geht's gut." "He says everything's just fine," said Eddie. "Oh, you're fluent, mighty fluent," said Buzzer. "Yes, I've traveled extensively, you might say," said Eddie. The older man came to life and yelled at the man who was working on the motor, yelled shrilly and threateningly. The blonde seemed frightened. He went to work on the motor with redoubled desperation. The older man's eyes, bleary a moment before, were wide and bright now. Several refugees turned to stare as they passed. The older man glanced challengingly from one face to the next and filled his lungs to shout something at them. But he changed his mind, sighed instead, and his spirits collapsed. He hurled his face in his hands. "What'd he say?" said Buzzer. "He don't speak my particular dialect," said Eddie. "Speaks low-class German, huh?" said Buzzer. "Well, I'm not going another step until we find somebody who can tell us what's going on. We're American boys. Our side won, didn't it? What we doing all tangled up with these Jerrys?" You Americans," said the blonde surprisingly enough in English. "Now you will have to fight them." "Here's one that talks English," said Buzzer. "Talks pretty good, too," said Eddie. Ain't bad at all," said Buzzer. "Who we gotta fight?" "The Russians," said the young German, seeming to relish the idea. "They'll kill you, too, if they catch you. They're killing everybody in their path." "Hell, man," said Buzzer. "We're on their side." "For how long?" "Run, boys, run!" The blonde swore and hurled his wrench at the motor. He turned to the old man and spoke, scared to death of him. The older man released a stream of German abuse, tired of it quickly, got out of the car and slammed the door behind him. The two looked anxiously in the direction from which the tanks would come and started down the road on foot. "Where you guys headed?" said Eddie. "Prague. The Americans are in Prague." Eddie and Buzzer fell in behind them. "Sure getting a mess of geography today, ain't we, Eddie?" said Buzzer. He stumbled, and Eddie caught him. "Uh-oh, Eddie. That old booze is sneaking up on me." "Yeah," said Eddie, whose own senses were growing fuzzier. "I say to hell with Prague. If we don't ride, we don't go, and that's that." "Sure. We'll just find us some shady spot and sit and wait for the Russians. We'll just show 'em our dog tags," said Buzzer. "And when they see 'em, bet they give us a big banquet." He dipped a finger inside his collar and brought out the tags on their string. "Oh my, yes," said the blonde German, who had been listening carefully. "A wonderful big banquet they'll give you." The column had been moving more and more slowly, growing more packed. Now it came to a muttering halt. "Must be a woman up front trying to read a road map," said Buzzer. From far down the road came an exchange of shouts like a distant surf. Restless, anxious moments later, the cause of the trouble was clear. The column had met another, fleeing in terror from the opposite direction. The Russians had the area surrounded. Now the two columns merged to form an aimless whirlpool in the heart of a small village, flooding out into side lanes and up the slopes on either side. "Don't know anybody in Prague anyhow," said Buzzer, and he wandered off the road and sat by the gate of a walled farmyard. Eddie followed his example. "By God," he said, "maybe we ought to stay right here and open us up a gun shop, Buzzer." He included in a sweep of his hand the discarded rifles and pistols that were strewn over the grass. "Bullets and all." "Swell place to open a gun shop, Europe is," said Buzzer. "They're just crazy about guns around here." Despite the growing panic of the persons milling about them, Buzzer dropped off into a brandy-induced nap. Eddie had trouble keeping his eyes open. "Aha!" said a voice from the road. "Here our American friends are." Eddie looked up to see the two Germans, the husky young man and the irascible older one, grinning down at them. "Hello," said Eddie. The cheering edge of the brandy was wearing off, and queasiness was taking its place. The young German pushed open the gate to the farmyard. "Come in here, would you?" he told Eddie. "We have something important to say to you." "Say it here," said Eddie. The blonde leaned down. "We've come to surrender to you." "You've come to what?" "We surrender," said the blonde. "We are your prisoners, prisoners of the United States Army." Eddie laughed. "Seriously?" "Buzzer." Eddie nudged his buddy with the toe of his boot. "Hey, Buzzer, you gotta hear this." "Huh? We just captured some people." Buzzer opened his eyes and squinted at the pair. "You're drunker than I am, by God, Eddie, going out capturing people," he said at last. "You damn fool, the war's over." He waved his hand magnanimously. "Turn 'em loose. Take us through the Russian lines to Prague as American prisoners, and you'll be heroes," said the blonde. He lowered his voice. "This is a famous German general. Think of it. You two can bring him in as your prisoner." "He really a general?" Buzzer said. "Heil Hitler, Pop." The older man raised his arm in an abbreviated salute. "Got a little pepper left in him at that," said Buzzer. "From what I heard," said Eddie, "me and Buzzer will be heroes if we get just us through the Russian lines, let alone a German general." The noise of the tank column of the Red Army grew louder. All right, said the blonde. "Sell us your uniforms, then. You'll still have your dog tags, and you can take our clothes." "I'd rather be poor than dead," said Eddie. "Wouldn't you, Buzzer?" "Just a minute, Eddie," said Buzzer. "Just hold on. What'll you give us?" "Come into the farmyard. We can't show you here," said the blonde. "I even heard there were some Nazis in the neighborhood," said Buzzer. "Come on, give us a little peek here." "Now who's a damn fool?" said Eddie. "Just want to be able to tell my grandchildren what I passed up," said Buzzer. The blonde was going through his pockets. He pulled out a fat roll of German currency. "Confederate money," said Buzzer. "What else you got?" It was then that the old man showed them his pocket watch. 4 diamonds, a ruby, and gold. And there in the midst of a mob of every imaginable sort of refugee, the blonde told Buzzer and Eddie that they could have the watch if they would go behind a wall and exchange their ragged American uniforms for a German civilian clothes. They thought Americans were so dumb. This was all so funny and crazy. Eddie and Buzzer were so drunk. What a story they would have to tell when they got home. They didn't want the watch. They wanted to get home alive. In the midst of a mob of every imaginable sort of refugee, the blonde was showing them a small pistol, as though they could have that too along with the watch. But it was now impossible for anybody to say any more funny stuff and still be heard. The earth shook, and the air was ripped to shreds as armored vehicles from the victorious Soviet Union, thundering and backfiring, came up the road. Everybody who could got out of the way of the juggernaut. Some were not so lucky. They were mangled. They were squashed. Eddie and Buzzer and the old man and the blonde found themselves behind the wall, where the blonde had said the Americans could swap their uniforms for the watch and civilian clothes. In the uproar, during which anybody could do anything and nobody cared what anybody else did, the blonde shot Buzzer in the head. He aimed his pistol at Eddie. He fired. He missed. That had evidently been the plan all along, to kill Eddie and Buzzer. But what chance did the old man, who spoke no English, have to pass himself off to his captors as an American? None. It was the blonde who was going to do that, and they were both about to be captured. All the old man could do was commit suicide. Eddie went back over the wall, putting it between himself and the blonde. But the blonde didn't care what had become of him. Everything the blonde needed was on Buzzer's body. When Eddie peered over the wall to see if Buzzer was still alive, the blonde was stripping the body. The old man now had the pistol. He put its muzzle in his mouth and blew his brains out. The blonde walked off with Buzzer's clothes and dog tags. Buzzer was in his GI underwear and dead, without ID. On the ground between the old man and Buzzer, Eddie found the watch. It was running. It told the right time. Eddie picked it up and put it in his pocket. The rainstorm outside Joe Bain's pawn shop had stopped. "When I got home," said Eddie, "I wrote Buzzer's folks. I told them he'd been killed in a fight with a German, even though the war was over. I told the army the same thing. I didn't know the name of the place where he died, so there was no way they could look for his body and give him a decent funeral. I had to leave him there. Whoever buried him, unless they could recognize GI underwear, wouldn't have known he was American. He could have been a German. He could have been anything." Eddie snatched the watch from under the pawnbroker's nose. "Thanks for letting me know what it's worth," he said. "Makes more sense to keep it for a souvenir." "500," said Bain, but Eddie was already on his way out the door. 10 minutes later, the shoeshine boy returned with a translation of the inscription inside the watch. This was it. To General Heinz Guderian, Chief of the Army General Staff, who cannot rest until the last enemy soldier is driven from the sacred soil of the Third German Reich, Adolf Hitler.